18 is supposed to mean freedom. For Riley, it meant a black trash bag full of hand-me-downs and a deadbolt clicking shut behind her. The foster system was done with her. The world didn't care. All she had to her name was $32, a shattered phone, and a tarnished brass key her grandfather made her swear to keep. It unlocked a rusted-out 1978 transit bus rotting in a scrapyard. She went looking for a place to sleep. She found a legacy. The rain in Erie didn't fall. It spat. It drove sideways off the lake, sharp and freezing, stinging Riley's cheeks as she hauled her garbage bag of belongings down the shoulder of Route 5. She was officially an adult. Happy birthday to her. The state cut the funding the second the clock struck midnight on her 18th birthday. Her current foster mother, a woman who treated children less like human beings and more like bi-weekly uncashed checks, had her bags packed and waiting by the door at dawn. No breakfast, no good luck out there, just a lock turning loudly in the quiet morning air. Riley didn't cry. Crying was a useless biological function that blurred your vision when you needed to be looking out for threats. Instead, she tightened her grip on the plastic bag, feeling the sharp edge of a hardcover book poking through the thin black plastic, and walked. She had one destination. It wasn't a shelter. Shelters in this part of town meant getting your shoes stolen while you slept with one eye open. She was heading for a Bank of America downtown, carrying a key she'd kept pinned to the inside of her bra for 5 years. Her grandfather, Arthur, had been dead since she was 13. He was a quiet, hulking man whose hands were permanently stained with motor oil and who smelled perpetually of cheap pipe tobacco and diesel fuel. He wasn't allowed to take her in when her mother died. The state deemed his living conditions unsuitable for a child. But on the day she was shoved into the back of a social worker's sedan, he had pressed a cold, flat brass key into her palm. "When they cut you loose, kid," he had rasped, his lungs already giving out. "Box 402. Don't look before then, they'll take it from you." She walked 6 miles in the freezing sleet to reach the bank. She dripped onto the polished marble floors, ignoring the security guard's hard, evaluating stare. Box 402 didn't hold stacks of cash. It didn't hold a magic solution to her empty stomach or her soaked, freezing sneakers. Inside the long metal drawer was a single manila envelope. Inside the envelope was a faded, blue-bordered vehicle title for a 1978 Bluebird bus, a set of heavy iron keys on a frayed paracord lanyard, and a receipt for a long-term parking lease at Gary's Pull-Apart and Storage on the industrial edge of town. The lease was paid up exactly to the month of her 18th birthday. There was no letter, no sentimental note, just the bare administrative bones of ownership. Riley stared at the paperwork. A bus, a 40-year-old bus parked in a junkyard. "Real funny, Artie," she muttered, her voice cracking in the sterile quiet of the vault. She shoved the papers into her jacket pocket, left the key on the table, and walked back out into the sleet. It took her another 2 hours to reach Gary's Pull-Apart. It was a miserable stretch of acreage surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with rusted razor wire. The ground was less dirt and more a toxic slurry of mud, crushed glass, and leaked antifreeze. She found the office, a corrugated tin shack smelling of stale beer and wet dog. The man behind the counter, presumably Gary or whoever had inherited the mess from him, didn't even look up from his small, static-filled television. "Spot 84, Riley said, sliding the faded receipt across the scratched Formica counter. The man glanced at it, then at her dripping clothes. "Back of the lot. Past the crushed Fords. Don't touch nothing that ain't yours. And hey," he pointed a thick, grease-stained finger at her. "Eudaw, lease expires on the 1st. That's Friday. You owe me $200 by Friday, or I crush the thing for scrap, understood?" "Understood," Riley lied. She had $32. She waded through the mud, navigating alleys of stacked, crushed cars that looked like rusted metallic skeletons. At the very back, backed up against a collapsing retaining wall, sat Spot 84. It was hideous. The 1978 Bluebird had once been school base yellow, but decades of neglect and harsh Pennsylvania winters had oxidized the paint into a sickly, peeling mustard. The tires were flat, the heavy rubber dry-rotted and sinking deep into the mud. The front windshield had a spiderweb crack spanning the passenger side, sealed poorly with yellowed packing tape. Green moss grew thick along the rain gutters. It looked exactly like a tomb. Riley stood in the freezing rain, her shoulders dropping. She had walked miles, banking on some hidden, grand gesture from the only family member who ever looked at her with an ounce of warmth. She had fantasized about a cozy, converted RV, a mobile home she could drive away, out of this state, out of this life. Instead, she inherited garbage. Her fingers were numb as she fumbled with the paracord lanyard. She shoved the key into the heavy metal door. It wouldn't turn. She hit the door with the heel of her hand, cursing, hitting it again and again until her skin bruised, throwing her weight into it. The lock ground in protest, snapped loudly, and the bifold doors groaned open, scraping against the rusted frame. Riley stepped inside, pulling her trash bag in with her, and pulled the door shut. The sound of the rain was instantly magnified, drumming a deafening, hollow beat against the metal roof. It was freezing inside, smelling of mildew, ancient dust, and stale vinyl, but it was dry. She sank onto the metal steps, put her head in her hands, and let the darkness of the bus swallow her. Morning brought a gray, bruised light that filtered through the filthy windows. Riley woke up shivering so violently her teeth clicked. She had spent the night curled in the driver's seat, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned from her trash bag. Her muscles were locked tight, her joints aching from the cold metal and the awkward angle of the seat. She forced herself to uncurl, groaning as her spine popped. She needed to take stock. The interior of the bus was stripped, but not finished. Arthur had clearly started a conversion project and abandoned it halfway. The original green vinyl seats were gone, replaced by an expanse of, cheap, peeling linoleum. In the back, a crude wooden bed frame had been built over the rear wheel wells. There was a small, rusted wood stove bolted to the floor near the center, its exhaust pipe routed clumsily through a punched-out window, sealed with sheet metal and cracked silicone. Along the left wall ran a set of heavy, steel-plated cabinets that looked like they belonged in a mechanic's garage rather than a living space. They were locked with heavy padlocks. Riley checked her pockets. She had the one door key, nothing for the padlocks. Her stomach gave a vicious, twisting cramp. The $32 wouldn't go far, but she needed calories. She needed heat. She spent the next 3 days in a cycle of pure survival. During the day, she hiked to a nearby gas station, washing her face in the grim bathroom sink, buying sleeves of stale saltines and jars of cheap peanut butter. She found a pallet manufacturing plant a mile down the road and dragged discarded splintered wood back to the lot, piece by piece, hiding it from the yard manager's sight. Getting a fire started in the rusted stove was a nightmare of smoke and damp wood, but when it finally caught, the radiant heat off the cast iron was the most beautiful thing Riley had ever felt. She sat cross-legged on the linoleum, feeding the flames, watching the shadows dance against the curved metal ceiling. For a brief, fleeting moment it felt like a home. Then Friday came. The pounding on the bus doors was loud enough to shake the frame. Riley jumped, dropping the saltine she was holding. "Hey, open up!" She peered through the cracked windshield. It was the yard manager, not Gary, but a guy whose name tag read Stan. He held a clipboard and a heavy iron flashlight, tapping it impatiently against the glass. Riley unlocked the door and pushed it open just enough to stand in the gap. The blast of cold air from outside immediately stole the meager warmth she had built up. "It's the first," Stan said, not bothering with pleasantries. His eyes darted past her, taking in the smoke curling from the stovepipe. "You're squatting in there. Gary doesn't like squatters." "I own it. The title is in my name," Riley said, keeping her voice flat, devoid of the panic rising in her chest. "Oh, you own the hunk of junk. You don't own the dirt it's sinking into. $200 for the month, or I bring the forklift over and haul this thing to the crusher, with or without your stuff inside." "I just got it," Riley said. "Give me a week. I'll get a job. I'll get the money." Stan laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound. "A week? Look around, kid. This whole town is out of work. You ain't getting $200 in a week. You got until Monday, 72 hours. Then I scrap it. The metal weight is worth more than your rent anyway." He turned and trudged back through the mud, leaving Riley standing in the doorway. She closed the door and locked it. She leaned against the freezing metal, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor. Monday. She had 3 days. Her mind raced through options: prostitution, theft, begging. The first made her skin crawl, the second she was terrible at, and the third wouldn't yield $200 in a city where everyone else was broke too. She looked around the dim interior of the bus. The metal weight is worth more than your rent anyway. Stan's words echoed in her head. She stared at the heavy steel mechanics cabinets lining the wall. She stared at the thick, reinforced steel plating around the wood stove. If they were going to scrap it on Monday, she'd scrap it first. Arthur had built this thing weirdly heavy. If she could rip out the steel cabinets, pry up the heavy aluminum trim, maybe even pull the copper wiring out of the engine bay, she could haul it to the recycling center downtown. It wouldn't be $200, but it might be enough to bribe Stan for another week. She needed tools. She scoured the bus. Under the wooden bed frame in the back, she found a plastic milk crate covered in dust. Inside were a few rusted wrenches, a pair of vice grips, and a heavy, solid iron crowbar. She grabbed the crowbar. Its weight felt good in her hands, grounding. It was a tool of destruction, and right now, destruction was her only currency. She started with the padlocked cabinets. Riley didn't know anything about metalwork, but she knew about anger. She took all the rage of the last 5 years, the foster homes, the cold, the hunger, the absolute crushing unfairness of being left alone in the world, and channeled it into the iron bar. She swung the crowbar at the padlock of the first cabinet. The clang deafened her in the enclosed space, vibrating up her arms and jarring her teeth. The lock didn't budge. She swung again. And again. Her knuckles bled where she scraped them against the steel. Her breath came in ragged white plumes in the freezing air. She wedged the curved claw of the crowbar behind the heavy locking hasp, planted her boots against the cabinet door, and pulled with her entire body weight. Metal shrieked. The bolts holding the hasp to the cabinet tore through the sheet metal with a sickening tear. The door sprang open, throwing Riley backward onto the hard linoleum. She scrambled up, panting, staring into the dark cavity of the cabinet. It was empty. "Son of a bitch," she hissed, her voice echoing. She moved to the next cabinet, woke up the metal, pried, pulled, tore it open. Empty. She spent 3 hours destroying the interior of the bus. She ripped down the thin plywood ceiling panels, hoping to find heavy copper wiring, but found only cheap, mouse-chewed fiberglass insulation that rained down on her like toxic snow. She unbolted the steel plates around the stove, discovering they were thin gauge, barely worth pennies at the scrapyard. She was covered in dust, sweat, and dried blood. She sat on the edge of the wooden bed frame, staring at the ruined interior of the only shelter she had. She had destroyed it for nothing. The scrap she'd generated might fetch $20, tops. She dropped the crowbar. It hit the linoleum floor near the back wheel well. Instead of a sharp smack of iron on concrete-backed flooring, it made a heavy, hollow thud. Riley frowned. She wiped the sweat and fiberglass dust from her forehead, smearing grime across her face. She picked up the crowbar and tapped the floor near the center of the bus. Smack. Solid metal chassis underneath. She tapped the floor near the right wheel well. Smack. Solid. She reached under the overhang of the wooden bed frame, right against the back corner wall, and tapped the linoleum again. Thud. Hollow. She crawled onto the bed frame on her hands and knees. The space was cramped, smelling sharply of old oil. She ran her fingers over the linoleum. There was a seam. It was incredibly well hidden, tucked exactly along the grout line of a fake tile pattern in the vinyl, practically invisible unless you were inches away from it. Arthur wasn't a carpenter. He was a mechanic. He didn't build with wood. He built with steel. Riley wedged the thin edge of the crowbar into the microscopic seam. It wouldn't catch. She grabbed a rusted flathead screwdriver from the milk crate, placed it in the seam, and hammered the back of it with the side of the crowbar. With a sharp crack, the screwdriver drove in. Riley levered it back. A section of the floor, about 2 feet wide and 3 feet long, popped upward an inch. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She threw the screwdriver aside, jammed the crowbar under the raised edge, and threw her weight into it. The false floor groaned. It wasn't wood. It was a heavy plate of quarter-inch steel covered in a glued layer of linoleum, secured by friction and heavy industrial magnets set into the chassis. With a final, screaming heave of metal scraping metal, the plate flipped backward. Riley sat back on her heels, coughing as a cloud of stale, dry air wafted up from the compartment. She fumbled in her jacket pocket, pulled out her phone. The screen shattered, the battery at 14%, and turned on the flashlight. She shined the harsh LED beam into the dark hole. It wasn't deep, maybe 8 inches, built flush over the frame rails. The inside was lined with thick, dry cedar planks to absorb moisture. Sitting in the center of the cedar box were 3 objects. The first was a heavy olive-drab military ammunition can, the metal stamped with faded yellow lot numbers. The second was a soft, battered leather satchel, stained dark with years of handling. The third was a small, square wooden box, intricately carved, sitting beside a folded piece of paper. Riley didn't breathe. The cold of the bus vanished. The gnawing in her stomach faded. She reached down and grabbed the handle of the ammo can. She braced herself to lift it with one hand, but as she pulled, her arm jerked sharply. The can didn't move. It was impossibly heavy. She used both hands, hauling the metal box up onto the linoleum floor. It hit the deck with a dense, massive thud that shook the bus. She popped the heavy latch. The seal hissed faintly as it broke. She flipped the lid open. Riley stared. Her brain, wired for poverty, wired for counting pennies and rationing saltines, couldn't immediately process what she was looking at. Inside the can, wrapped individually in oil-stained rags, were bricks. They were about the size of a modern smartphone, but an inch thick. She reached in and unwrapped one. It was dull, gray metal, slightly tarnished at the edges, but heavy, so heavy it made her wrist ache. Stamped deeply into the face of the metal were the words, Johnson Matthey, Assayers and Refiners. Fine silver, $9.99, 100 troy ounces. Riley dropped it. It hit the linoleum, denting the floor. 100 ounces. She didn't know the exact spot price of silver, but she knew it wasn't cheap, and there were at least 10 bricks in the can. Her hands were shaking violently now, not from the cold, but from the massive adrenaline spike flooding her nervous system. She turned her flashlight to the leather satchel. She pulled it up from the compartment. It was lighter. She unbuckled the straps. Inside were dozens of smaller, heavy canvas pouches. She opened one and poured the contents into her palm. A dozen heavy, perfectly preserved silver coins spilled out. Morgan silver dollars, eagles, dates from the 1880s, the 1920s. She was sitting on a fortune. Arthur had been a hoarder, a paranoid old mechanic who didn't trust banks, didn't trust the government, didn't trust anyone, except apparently her. She looked back into the compartment. The small, carved wooden box and the piece of paper were still there. She picked up the paper. It was stiff, yellowed parchment. Unfolding it, she recognized Arthur's handwriting immediately. Blocky, hard, written by a man who gripped a pen like a wrench. Riley, if you're reading this, it means you hit 18 and the state finally let you go. I'm sorry I wasn't there. They said I wasn't fit. Maybe they were right. This world takes everything from people like us, kid. It bleeds you dry and charges you for the bandage. I spent 30 years fixing other people's broken machines, turning every spare dime into something real. Something they couldn't inflate away or freeze in a bank account. The silver will keep you alive. You can sell it piecemeal, but the box is why I built the false floor. The box is the real inheritance. Don't sell what's in the box until you know exactly what you have. There are people who have been looking for it for a very long time. Watch your back. Grandpa Artie. Riley slowly lowered the letter. The silence of the bus was absolute, save for the faint pinging of the cooling wood stove. She reached into the dark cedar compartment and pulled out the small, carved wooden box. It wasn't heavy, but the wood felt incredibly old, smooth and cool to the touch. She clicked off her dying phone flashlight to save battery. She sat in the dim, gray light of the rusted bus, holding the box in her lap. the cold weight of the silver bricks resting against her leg. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She had a target on her back, and for the first time in her life, she had power. Riley didn't open the small carved box immediately. She set it on the floorboards beside the heavy ammunition can. Her hands were still trembling, leaving streaks of black grime on the smooth, polished cedar. She took a deep breath, the frigid air burning her lungs, and finally flipped the tiny brass latch on the front of the box. Inside rested a bed of dark green velvet. Nestled in the center of the fabric was a heavy, dull gray iron cylinder, roughly the size of a spark plug, capped with a brass dial. Beside it lay a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed and flaking at the edges. Riley carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The headline, dated November 14, 1982, from a Chicago Tribune, read in stark black ink: $4 million in unregistered bearer bonds vanish in armored transit heist. She looked back at the iron cylinder. The brass dial on top had 3 rotating rings of numbers, a portable, mechanical safe, a cryptex. Arthur's letter echoed in her head. I spent 30 years fixing other people's broken machines. He must have found the cylinder hidden inside a vehicle, brought to his shop, an abandoned getaway car, or a wreck that someone never returned for. The people who stole the bonds 4 decades ago never retrieved their prize. Arthur found it, realized what it was, and buried it under the floor of a rusted Bluebird bus. There are people who have been looking for it for a very long time. Riley closed the wooden box. She didn't know the combination. She didn't want to know it yet. $4 million in unregistered bonds wasn't money. It was a death sentence for an 18-year-old girl living in a junkyard. But the silver was liquid. She repacked the heavy silver coins into the leather satchel and placed it, along with the wooden box and the remaining 9 silver bricks, back into the hidden floor compartment. She slammed the heavy steel plate down, kicked the linoleum flush, and dragged the plastic milk crate over the seam. She kept 1 brick, 100 troy ounces of 999 fine silver. It weighed just under 7 pounds. She wrapped it in a dirty, grease-stained flannel shirt, shoved it into the bottom of her black trash bag, and stepped out into the freezing rain. She walked past Stan's tin shack office without looking through the window. She hiked 3 miles into the industrial sector of the city, keeping her head down, the heavy weight of the brick bumping rhythmically against her spine. She found a pawn shop wedged between a liquor store and a boarded-up laundromat. The neon sign buzzed furiously, casting a sickly pink glow over the barred windows: Apex, Gold, and Loan. Riley pushed the heavy glass door open. The shop smelled of stale cigarette smoke, brass polish, and desperation. Ossetic glass counters lined the walls, filled with stolen power tools, cheap guitars, and trays of tarnished wedding rings. A man sat behind a thick partition of bulletproof glass. He was heavy-set, wearing a tight polyester polo, chewing on a plastic coffee stirrer. He didn't look up from his phone when the door chimes rang. Riley walked up to the counter. She reached into her bag, unwrapped the flannel shirt, and placed the heavy silver brick onto the scratched metal transaction tray. The heavy clunk of the metal hitting the tray made the man flinch. He looked up, his eyes dropping immediately to the brick. The boredom vanished from his face, replaced by a sharp, calculating glint. "Where'd you steal this, kid?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble through the intercom speaker. "I inherited it," Riley said. Her voice was steady. She kept her hands in her pockets to hide her shaking fingers. "It's 100 ounces, Johnson Mathey." The pawnbroker slid the tray toward him, pulling the brick to his side of the glass. He picked it up, weighing it in his palm, feeling the cold, dense mass of it. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small black stone and a dropper bottle of nitric acid. He scratched the edge of the brick against the stone, leaving a thick, silvery streak. He applied a drop of the acid. The liquid turned a bright, creamy white. "It's real," he muttered, wiping the stone clean. He looked at Riley, taking in her soaked, oversized jacket, her bruised knuckles, and the dirt smeared across her forehead. He saw prey. "Spot price on silver took a hit this week," he lied smoothly. "Plus it's an assay bar, not government minute. Harder to move. I'll give you $600 for it." Riley stared at him. She had spent an hour on her dying phone sitting on a wet curb outside a gas station, researching the exact market value. Spot price opened at $24.12 an ounce this morning, Riley said, her tone completely flat. Oh, that brick is worth $2,412 in raw melt weight alone, and Johnson Matthey bars carry a premium for collectors. The pawnbroker's jaw tightened. He stopped chewing the plastic stirrer. I'm running a business, sweetheart, not a charity. You want retail value? Go open a brokerage account. You want cash today, with no paperwork and no questions asked about where a street kid got a 7-pound block of precious metal. I'll give you $1,000. Final offer. $2,000, Riley said, or I walk across the street to the jeweler on 5th Avenue and tell them you tried to fence stolen property. You think I don't see you looking at the lot number? The man's eyes narrowed. He looked at the serial number stamped into the silver, then back at Riley. He was weighing the risk. A scruffy teenager shouldn't know what a spot price was. $1,800, he growled. $2,000, $100 bills. Check them with the counterfeit pen in front of me. The pawnbroker glared at her for a long, silent moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, he dropped the brick into a steel drawer beneath his register. He pulled out a fat stack of cash, snapped a rubber band off it, and counted out 20 crisp $100 bills. He swiped each one with a chemical pen and pushed them through the slot. Riley took the money. She didn't count it again. She shoved it deep into her front jeans pocket, turned on her heel, and walked out. Behind the glass, the pawnbroker watched her leave. As soon as the door swung shut, he picked up the silver brick, stared at the lot number again, and reached for his desk phone. Riley didn't go straight back to the junkyard. She went to work. She walked into an auto parts warehouse a mile down the road. She dropped $600 on 2 massive commercial-grade 8D batteries, each weighing over 130 pounds. She bought a 5-gallon jerry can, filled it with fresh diesel at the corner station, and bought heavy-duty jumper cables, a can of starting fluid, fuel filters, and a cheap socket set. She paid a man driving a flatbed tow truck $50 to haul her, and the supplies back to Gary's pull-apart, dropping the heavy equipment right outside the rusted doors of the bus. It was 4 p.m. when she started. She had until Monday morning to pay Stan, but she had no intention of paying rent to live in a toxic swamp. She was leaving tonight. The engine bay of the Bluebird was in the front, accessible by pulling a heavy fiberglass doghouse cover inside the cab. Riley pried it open. The smell of ancient grease, dry-rotted rubber, and stagnant oil hit her like a physical blow. Nestled in the chassis was a massive, inline-6 diesel engine. It was covered in grime, but the heavy cast-iron block looked solid. Arthur wouldn't have kept a vehicle with a blown engine. She worked until her hands bled. She used the socket set to loosen the rusted retaining brackets, muscling the heavy new batteries into the side compartment, straining until she saw white flashes behind her eyes. She cleaned the corroded battery terminals with a wire brush and clamped the heavy cables down. She crawled under the bus in the freezing mud, draining the old sludgy water from the fuel water separator. She poured the 5 gallons of fresh diesel directly into the tank. Then came the hard part. The fuel system was full of air. Using Arthur's heavy wrenches, she cracked the injector lines on the side of the engine block. She climbed into the driver's seat, inserted the tarnished brass key she'd kept pinned to her chest for 5 years, and turned it. The dashboard remained dark. No lights, no buzzer. Panic flared in her chest. She checked the battery connections. Solid. She traced the thick wiring harness. Right near the steering column, she found a heavy kill switch Arthur had installed, hidden under a flap of torn vinyl. She flipped it. Instantly, the dashboard illuminated. A loud, continuous air pressure warning buzzer screamed through the bus. She turned the key to crank. The starter motor engaged with a heavy, grinding roar. It was sluggish, fighting against years of stagnant oil and cold metal. She cranked it for 10 seconds, stopped, let the starter cool, cranked it again. She jumped out, checking the injector lines. Fresh, green-tinted diesel was weeping from the loose nuts, pushing the trapped air out. She tightened them down, her wrench slipping on the fuel, busting her knuckles against the block. She didn't feel the pain. She grabbed the can of starting fluid, sprayed a heavy mist directly into the air intake, and bolted back to the driver's seat. She turned the key and slammed her foot onto the accelerator pedal. The starter ground hard. Crick. The engine misfired violently, shaking the entire 40-foot frame of the bus. Riley kept the key turned. Crack bang. A massive plume of thick black soot blasted out of the rusted tailpipe, covering the junked Ford behind her. With a deafening concussive roar, the inline six caught. The bus vibrated wildly, the engine idling rough, hunting for fuel, coughing before finally smoothing out into a heavy, rhythmic, mechanical thunder. Riley dropped her head against the cracked steering wheel, letting out a jagged breath that was half laugh, half sob. The heater core kicked on, blowing a cloud of dust and the faint scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco into the cab. She watched the air pressure gauge slowly climb. 60 psi, 90 psi. The warning buzzer finally shut off. The air brakes were primed. She was ready. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed outside. Riley's head snapped up. Through the cracked, tape-covered windshield, she saw the junkyard gates swing violently open. A dark, late-model SUV tore into the yard, its headlights cutting through the sleet, illuminating the blowing exhaust of the bus. The SUV skidded to a halt in the mud 30 yards away. 4 doors opened simultaneously. Stan, the yard manager, was dragged out of the passenger side, his face bloodied, his hands zip-tied behind his back. 3 other men stepped out. They were heavy, wearing dark coats. One of them held a heavy steel tire iron. Another reached into his jacket, pulling out something metallic and black that glinted on the headlights. Garrison, the pawnbroker, had made his call. He didn't care about a single silver brick. He wanted the rest of the assay lot, and he had sent people who knew exactly how to extract it from an 18-year-old squatter. The men shoved Stan into the mud and began marching down the narrow alley of crushed cars, directly toward the idling bus. Riley didn't freeze. The fear burned away, instantly replaced by the cold, absolute survival instinct that had kept her alive in the system for 5 years. She reached down and pulled the heavy brass knob for the parking brake. Pssh. The air brakes released with a loud hiss, the bus shifting slightly in the mud. She grabbed the gear selector and yanked it into drive. The men were 20 yards away. The one with the gun raised his hand, shouting something over the roar of the diesel engine, stepping directly into her path. Riley gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She didn't reach for the crowbar. She didn't hide. She pressed her boot flat to the floor. The engine roared, black smoke violently spewing from the rear. The dry-rotted dual rear tires spun frantically in the mud, throwing massive roosters of toxic sludge backward. For a second, the bus didn't move. Then, the heavy treads bit into the gravel beneath the mud. The 20,000-pound steel leviathan lurched forward. The men's eyes widened in sheer panic. The man with the gun fired a single, wild shot that shattered the passenger side window, showering Riley in safety glass. She didn't flinch. She kept her foot pinned. The men scattered, diving into the freezing mud to avoid the massive steel bumper. The bus tore past them, clipping the open door of the SUV and snapping it off its hinges with a sickening crunch of tearing metal. Riley didn't look in the rearview mirror. She navigated the narrow dirt alley of the junkyard, the heavy steel frame of the bus scraping aggressively against the stacks of crushed cars, throwing sparks into the night air. She hit the chain-link front gates at 30 miles an hour. The rusted padlock didn't even slow her down. The gates exploded outward, the chain link tearing loudly as it dragged beneath the undercarriage. The bus slammed onto the asphalt of Route 5. The suspension bounced violently, the bald tires screaming against the wet road as Riley wrestled the heavy, unassisted steering wheel to straighten out. She hit the highway on ramp, the engine roaring, pulling her away from Erie, away from the Foster system, away from the cold. The heater was blowing hot air against her frozen legs. The rhythmic thrum of the diesel engine was a steady heartbeat. Under the floorboards, beneath the milk crate and the cheap linoleum, a king's ransom in silver and a lethal secret waited. Riley reached up and wiped a streak of grease and blood from her cheek. She was 18. She was officially an adult, and for the first time in her life, she was driving. Riley's journey from a discarded teenager to the guardian of a forgotten fortune proves that survival isn't just about enduring the storm, it's about finding the keys hidden in the wreckage. If you were captivated by Riley's gritty fight for freedom and want to see where the open road takes her next, hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a high-stakes underdog tale, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, action-packed audio dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you do with the Harriman bonds? See you in the next one.